Say it again, Ethan Caldwell said in smooth Arabic, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz floating across the rooftop. She wouldn't understand a word anyway. A few men at the table smirked into their crystal glasses, the kind that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, while the city of Manhattan glittered 50 stories below like a living constellation. Naomi Brooks stood just behind his chair, silent, steady, invisible by design, her black uniform pressed, her posture perfect, her eyes lowered just enough to make people comfortable underestimating her. The chandelier above scattered warm light across polished marble and gold-rimmed plates, but beneath that glow, something colder moved, something quieter, something watching. Ethan leaned back in his chair like he owned not just the company, not just the deal on the table worth $500 million, but the room itself, every breath in it bending slightly toward his approval. He tapped his glass once, not looking at Naomi, never looking at her, just lifting a finger the way powerful men do when they expect the world to respond on cue. She stepped forward, poured the wine with a steady hand, the deep red liquid catching the light like something expensive and untouchable, and still she said nothing. Around the table, investors from overseas nodded politely, their tailored suits sharp, their expressions unreadable, their silence heavier than the air. Ethan continued in Arabic, more relaxed now, more careless, explaining terms, numbers, leverage, the kind of details that decide who walks away with everything and who leaves with nothing. But beneath the business language, threaded between percentages and projections, was something else, something quieter, something crueler. A joke, a dismissal, a certainty that the woman behind him was not part of the conversation, not part of the equation, not even part of the room. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the bottle, just enough to feel the weight of it, just enough to remind herself she was still here, still grounded, still choosing silence. Because silence, she had learned, was not weakness. It was timing. Across the table, one of the foreign investors tilted his head slightly, catching a phrase, a tone, something that didn't quite sit right, but he said nothing, not yet. The music continued. Glasses clinked. The skyline shimmered. And Ethan smiled, confident, polished, untouchable, a man who had never been corrected in. A room like this, a man who believed language was a weapon only he knew how to use. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that the quietest person in the room had already understood everything, every word, every intention, every hidden edge beneath his deal, and she was no longer just listening. She was deciding. Naomi did not speak right away because she understood something most people in that room never learned. The moment you interrupt power, you inherit its weight, and once you speak, you cannot step back into invisibility. So she let the silence stretch just a fraction longer, just enough for Ethan's confidence to settle deeper into the room, just enough for the investors to lean back into their assumptions, and then she moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just one step forward into the light, where she was never meant to stand. Her voice calm, measured, unmistakably fluent as she answered in Arabic with the kind of precision that does not come from guessing but from knowing, correcting a single phrase first, then another, then the entire structure of what Ethan had just said, not raising her tone, not challenging him directly, simply stating the truth in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And for the first time that night the room did not respond to Ethan, it responded to her. The investors straightening in their seats, their attention shifting like a tide pulled by something stronger than money. One of them placing his glass down slowly, eyes narrowing as he processed her words, asking her to repeat the last line. Not him, her, and Naomi did, word for word, exposing the subtle clause Ethan had tried to bury beneath translation, the one that would have quietly shifted millions in leverage after the deal was signed. And suddenly the air changed, the kind of change you can feel before you understand it. Like pressure before a storm. Ethan's smile holding for a second too long before it faltered at the edges, his fingers tightening around the stem of his glass as he realized the conversation was no longer under his control, because control depends on who holds the truth, and right now it was not him. Naomi continued, still composed, still respectful, explaining the nuance he had twisted, not to embarrass him, not to perform, but to clarify, and that made it even more powerful because there was no anger in her voice, only accuracy, and accuracy is harder to fight than emotion. One investor leaned forward, now fully engaged, asking her a question in Arabic directly, testing her, measuring her, and she answered without hesitation, her pronunciation clean, her understanding deeper than surface level, the kind that comes from lived experience rather than memorized phrases. And the room responded again, this time with something quieter, something heavier, respect beginning to replace assumption, while Ethan sat there, still, calculating, trying to regain ground that had already shifted beneath him, because the woman he had dismissed as invisible had just rewritten the conversation without raising her voice, without asking permission, without breaking a single rule. And in that moment, Naomi Brooks was no longer part of the background. She was the axis the entire room had begun to turn around. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible, like the moment a scale tips before it fully drops, but everyone at that table felt it, even if they could not name it yet, because power had a new center now, and it was not sitting at the head of the table anymore. It was standing beside it, calm, composed, holding nothing but the truth, and that made it impossible to ignore. One of the senior investors adjusted his posture, turning fully toward Naomi as if recalibrating the entire meeting. Around her presence, his voice measured as he asked a follow-up question in Arabic, this time slower, more deliberate, not to test her intelligence but to confirm it. And Naomi answered again without hesitation, her tone steady, her words precise, not adding anything unnecessary, not trying to impress, simply making the meaning clear, and clarity in a room built on negotiation is more powerful than dominance. Across from her, another investor exchanged a glance with his colleague, a silent conversation passing between them, the kind that decides whether deals move forward or fall apart. While Ethan remained still, his mind racing behind a controlled expression, calculating angles, searching for a way to regain narrative control, but every second he stayed silent. Naomi's credibility grew, because silence from power, when it should speak, begins to look like uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing investors do not tolerate. Naomi continued only when spoken to, never overstepping, never claiming authority, yet somehow holding it. Anyway, explaining the structure of the agreement as it was originally intended, then carefully pointing out where interpretation had been bent, not accusing, not exposing for the sake of embarrassment, but restoring accuracy, and that distinction mattered, because it shifted the room from conflict to realization, from confrontation to correction. One investor leaned back, exhaling slowly as the implications settled in. The numbers were not just numbers anymore. They were trust, and trust once questioned becomes the most expensive variable in any deal. Ethan finally spoke, his voice smooth but tighter now, attempting to reframe the conversation, suggesting a misunderstanding, a translation nuance, something minor, something manageable. But the moment passed too quickly, because the same investor who had been silent earlier now raised his hand slightly, not to interrupt Naomi, but to pause Ethan. And that alone said everything, because moments ago no one would have paused him, and now they were choosing to listen to someone he had not even acknowledged minutes before. Naomi stepped back half an inch, not retreating, just resetting her position, returning the space to the table while still holding its attention, her presence no longer invisible, no longer optional. And as the skyline outside shimmered under the night sky, reflecting wealth, ambition, and everything people believed defined power, inside that room something far quieter had taken its place, something that could not be bought, could not be forced, could not be faked, and Ethan Caldwell understood it now, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to recognize that the person he dismissed had just become the most important voice in a deal he thought he controlled. What happened next did not come with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It came with something far more unsettling. Agreement, slow, deliberate, undeniable. One of the investors nodded once, then again, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as he looked directly at Naomi instead of Ethan, asking her to walk through the clause one more time, not because he did not understand, but because he wanted everyone else to hear it clearly, and Naomi did, her explanation even more refined now, breaking down the structure of the deal into simple, undeniable terms, showing how a single line, almost invisible in translation, would have shifted long-term control away from the investors without immediate notice, The kind of move that did not break rules, but bent trust. And in a room built on trust, that difference mattered more than anything else. The second investor leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the polished table, his expression no longer neutral, now focused, engaged, calculating risk in real time, while a third quietly reached for the printed documents, flipping through pages that suddenly felt heavier than before, because now they were not just reviewing numbers. They were questioning intent, and intent, once questioned, does not return to neutral. Ethan watched all of this unfold with a composed face, but his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of control. It was the stillness of someone recalibrating under pressure, searching for a way to reframe what had already been revealed. He spoke again, carefully, suggesting that perhaps the interpretation was being taken too far, that in complex international agreements language could be flexible, open to nuance. But this time his words did not land the same way, because the room had already shifted its trust, and once trust moves, language alone cannot pull it back. Naomi did not interrupt him. She did not challenge him directly. She simply waited, and when one of the investors turned to her again, asking a final question in Arabic, something deeper this time, something beyond surface-level translation, she answered without hesitation, explaining not just what was written, but how it would be understood in context, culturally, legally, and strategically. And that was the moment everything settled, because she was no longer just correcting him, she was outpacing him. The investors exchanged another glance, longer this time, heavier, the kind that closes doors without a single word spoken. One of them slowly pushed his chair back an inch, not leaving, but creating distance, a subtle signal that the dynamic at the table had changed. The deal was no longer moving forward as planned, and everyone knew it. Ethan saw it too. The realization landing not all at once, but in pieces, in the way people stopped looking at him first, in the way questions were redirected, in the way silence followed his words instead of agreement. And for the first time that night, he looked at Naomi, really looked at her, not as background, not as service, but as presence, as consequence, as the variable he had failed to calculate. And Naomi, standing there with nothing but composure and clarity, did not claim victory, did not shift her tone, did not step forward again, because she did not need to. The room had already answered the only question that mattered, and it was not in his favor. No one said the deal was off, not out loud, not yet, but the energy at the table had already made the decision. It lived in the way documents stopped moving, in the way glasses remained untouched, in the way silence lingered longer than it should in a room built for momentum. One of the investors finally leaned back fully, exhaling through his nose, as if releasing something heavier than just a business concern. His eyes shifting from Naomi to Ethan and then back again, recalculating trust in real time, because trust, once fractured, does not break loudly. It fades, it withdraws, it steps back inch by inch until nothing remains to stand on. Another investor closed the folder in front of him with a soft, deliberate motion, not dramatic, not aggressive, just final enough to be understood. And in that quiet gesture the entire trajectory of the evening shifted. Ethan felt it before anyone spoke. The subtle collapse of leverage, the quiet erosion of certainty, the realization that the room no longer moved with him but around him. And for a man who built his empire on control, that loss was louder than any accusation could ever be. He adjusted his posture, straightened his jacket slightly, the kind of movement meant to signal composure. But the timing was just a second too late, just enough to reveal that he was responding rather than leading. And in rooms like this, that difference is everything. Naomi remained where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply present. Her role unchanged on the surface, yet completely transformed beneath it. Because now when someone glanced her way, it was not out of dismissal but consideration, not out of habit but intention, and that shift carried weight. One of the investors spoke again, this time in English, his tone calm, but unmistakably firm as he suggested that perhaps the terms needed to be revisited, clarified, reviewed under a different lens, a professional way of saying that what had been presented was no longer acceptable as is. And though the words were measured, their impact was immediate. The deal, once certain, now uncertain, the outcome, once controlled, now open. Ethan nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement, because there was nothing else he could do in that moment without making the situation worse. His mind moving quickly behind composed eyes, already calculating recovery strategies, alternative approaches, ways to rebuild what had just been destabilized. But even as he thought through those options, one truth settled in, quiet and unavoidable. This shift had not come from a rival, not from a competitor, not from a market change. It had come from someone he had chosen not to see. And that realization carried a different kind of weight, one that numbers could not measure and strategy could not easily fix. Naomi lowered her gaze slightly again, not out of submission, but out of completion, her part in the moment finished without the need for recognition, without the need for acknowledgement, because the outcome spoke for itself. The room had changed, the power had moved, and the man who believed he understood every variable in the deal had just discovered the one he never accounted for was standing right behind him the entire time. The conversation did not end. It transformed, shifting from certainty to caution, from confidence to verification, and in that shift the entire rhythm of the room slowed down. One of the investors requested a brief pause, not an interruption but a recalibration, his assistant stepping forward quietly with a tablet, cross-checking figures, language, and clauses in real time. While another investor leaned toward Naomi once more, not with skepticism now, but with intent, asking her a more complex question in Arabic, something layered, something designed to test not just fluency, but depth of understanding. And Naomi answered again, her tone unchanged, her delivery consistent, explaining not only the literal meaning but the implication behind the phrasing, the kind of nuance that cannot be memorized, only understood. And that was when the final doubt disappeared from their eyes. Because this was no longer a coincidence, no longer a lucky correction. This was expertise, quiet, precise, undeniable. Ethan watched closely, his attention no longer divided, no longer distracted by the performance of control, but focused entirely on the woman he had overlooked, trying to trace back the moment he miscalculated, the moment he dismissed the one variable that would cost him leverage. And for a man who built his career on reading rooms, on anticipating outcomes, this was unfamiliar ground. Not losing, but not leading, and the difference unsettled him more than he would ever show. The skyline outside continued to shimmer, indifferent to the shift happening inside. The city moving forward as it always did, but within those glass walls something had already changed direction. The investors began speaking among themselves in low voices, some in Arabic, some in English, their tones measured, analytical. The language of decision-making rather than negotiation, and Ethan understood what that meant. When investors stop negotiating and start analyzing, the deal is no longer about opportunity. It is about risk, and risk, once elevated, rarely returns to its original state. Naomi stepped back slightly, allowing space for the discussion, her role complete in action but not in consequence. Because what she had introduced into the room could not be removed. Truth once spoken does not disappear, it settles, it reshapes, it redefines. One of the investors finally turned back toward Ethan, his expression composed but firm, thanking him for the presentation, then adding that further review would be necessary before any commitments could be made. The words polite, professional, but carrying the unmistakable weight of withdrawal, not a rejection, but a step back. And in high-level negotiations, a step back is often the most expensive outcome of all. Ethan nodded once, accepting the statement with controlled composure, because anything else would reveal more than he could afford. But inside, the calculation had already shifted. The outcome he had entered the room expecting was no longer on the table, and he knew exactly when that changed. Not when the clause was questioned, not when the investors leaned forward, but the moment a voice he dismissed spoke with clarity he could not override. Naomi adjusted her grip on the empty tray, her posture returning to neutral, her presence once again blending into the background by choice, not by assumption, because now invisibility was no longer something placed on her. It was something she could step in and out of at will. And as the meeting dissolved into quieter conversations and measured exits, one truth remained, steady, undeniable. The most powerful shift in the room had not come from wealth, status, or strategy. It had come from awareness, from timing, from a single decision to speak when it mattered most, and the cost of ignoring that had just been made very clear. The meeting did not end with a handshake. It unraveled quietly, one chair sliding back, then another, the soft scrape of polished wood against marble sounding louder than it should, because every movement now carried meaning. Every exit felt like a decision already made. The investors gathered their documents with measured precision, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate, as if each page they lifted confirmed what had just shifted. One of them gave a polite nod toward Ethan, professional, composed, but distant, the kind of nod that acknowledges presence without offering trust. And then his attention moved, just slightly, toward Naomi, not long, not obvious, but enough to register, enough to signal recognition. And in rooms like this, recognition is its own currency. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting on the table, fingers still, eyes fixed not on the skyline, not on the departing investors, but on the space where control used to sit, because he could feel it, the absence of it, the quiet vacuum left behind when authority slips without warning. He stood finally, adjusting his jacket out of habit, the gesture automatic, practiced, but the timing again just slightly off, just enough to reveal that the rhythm he once dictated had changed. Around him the staff moved efficiently, clearing glasses, resetting plates, restoring the illusion of normalcy, because that is what places like this do. They absorb disruption and present calm, but beneath that surface, the shift remained. Naomi moved with the same precision as before, collecting empty glasses, aligning utensils, her movements unchanged, her expression composed. But the room no longer saw her the same way. Even those who did not fully understand what had happened could feel that something had, and that feeling lingered. One of the junior associates paused for half a second as she passed, watching her with a different kind of attention. Not curiosity, not dismissal, but awareness, and then quickly looked away. Unsure of what to do with that realization, Ethan turned slightly as Naomi approached to clear the last glass from his place. And for the first time that night, there was no distance in his gaze, no dismissal, no assumption, just a brief, silent acknowledgement, not an apology, not yet, but something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when reality corrects perception. Naomi met his eyes for a fraction of a second, then lowered her gaze again, not out of submission, but out of control, choosing the moment, defining the boundary, and then she moved on, because she did not need to hold the moment longer than it needed to exist. The power of it was already established. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, taxis weaving through traffic, lights reflecting off glass towers, deals being made and broken in rooms just like this one. But inside, something quieter had settled into place, a recalibration that would not appear in reports or headlines, yet would influence every decision that followed. Ethan stood alone for a brief moment after the room had nearly emptied, the echoes of conversation replaced by the soft hum of the city beyond the glass. And in that silence, one truth remained clear: the most important shift of the night had not been written into any contract. It had been spoken, calmly, precisely, by someone he never thought to hear. And now he would have to decide what to do with that truth, because ignoring it was no longer an option. The room had nearly emptied, but the weight of what had happened refused to leave with it, lingering in the air like a question no one had answered out loud. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, resetting the table for the next group that would walk in unaware of the shift that had just taken place. Glasses replaced, chairs aligned, surfaces restored to perfection, but perfection here was only visual, because beneath it something had cracked, something subtle but permanent. Ethan did not rush to leave. He stood near the edge of the table for a moment longer, watching the final investor disappear through the glass doors, his reflection briefly overlapping with the city lights beyond. A man who still looked powerful from the outside, still carried the same tailored suit, the same posture, the same presence. But inside, the equation had changed, and he knew it, not in a dramatic realization, not in a sudden collapse, but in a quiet, steady awareness that the advantage he once assumed was no longer guaranteed. He turned slightly, scanning the room not as an owner now, but as someone rereading it, searching for what he had missed, and his eyes found her again. Naomi moving between tables with the same controlled rhythm, her steps measured, her expression neutral, as if nothing had happened at all. And that was what unsettled him the most, because to him everything had changed, but to her, it was simply a moment completed, not a performance, not a victory, just a decision made and carried out. He took a step toward her, then paused, recalculating even this, because for the first time that night, he was not sure how to approach the conversation, not sure what position he held in it. And uncertainty was not a space he occupied often. Naomi reached the service station, placing the tray down with quiet precision, aligning the glasses without looking rushed, without looking distracted, fully present in the task at hand. And that presence carried more control than anything Ethan had displayed earlier, because it was not dependent on anyone else's reaction. It was self-contained, steady, grounded. He approached finally, his footsteps controlled but no longer authoritative, stopping at a respectful distance rather than stepping into her space. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence different now, not heavy with tension, but filled with recognition. He looked at her, really looked this time, not searching for status or role, but for understanding, trying to reconcile the image he had constructed with the reality standing in front of him. And Naomi, without lifting her gaze immediately, seemed to sense the shift, not reacting to it, not acknowledging it outwardly, just allowing it to exist. Because she did not need to define the moment, it was already defined by everything that had happened before it. The city lights reflected softly across the glass behind them, casting long, quiet shadows across the floor, and in that stillness, the difference between who held power and who understood it became clearer than it had ever been. Ethan opened his mouth slightly as if to speak, then stopped, the words not forming as easily as they once did, because whatever he said next would not be heard the same way, not by her, not by himself, and that realization held him there for just a second longer than he expected, long enough to understand that the conversation he was about to begin would not be one he controlled, but one he entered, and for the first time that night, that distinction mattered more than anything else. "You understood everything," Ethan said finally, his voice quieter now, not the tone of a man addressing a room, but of someone speaking to a single truth he could no longer ignore. Naomi lifted her gaze just enough to meet his, her expression calm, unreadable, not defensive, not impressed, simply present, and for a moment the distance between them was not about status or role, it was about clarity. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when control is no longer the priority. Understanding is. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" he asked, not accusing, not demanding, just asking, and Naomi held his gaze for a fraction longer before answering, her voice steady, measured. "Because you were not ready to listen." The words did not land like an attack, they landed like a fact, simple, direct, undeniable, and Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to correct, only something to process. The city outside continued to glow, indifferent to the quiet exchange unfolding inside. But in that moment, the difference between noise and meaning became clear. He nodded once, a small movement, but genuine. "And now?" he asked, the question unfinished but understood. Naomi glanced briefly toward the empty table where the deal had unraveled, then back at him. "Now it does not matter what I say, it matters what you understand," she replied. And there it was, the shift fully realized, not in contracts, not in numbers, but in perspective. Ethan looked at her again, not searching for answers this time, but recognizing them, the kind of recognition that does not come with applause or announcement, only with quiet acceptance. He straightened slightly, not to reclaim authority, but to carry himself differently, because something in him had adjusted, recalibrated, and for the first time that night, he did not look past her, he acknowledged her, fully, without assumption, without dismissal, just recognition. Naomi lowered her gaze again, returning to her work, not because the moment was small, but because it was complete. She did not need to extend it, did not need to hold it longer than necessary, because the lesson had already been delivered, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly, and clarity, once given, does not fade. It stays, it follows, it reshapes the way future decisions are made. Ethan turned toward the exit, his steps measured, not rushed, not delayed, carrying with him something heavier than a lost deal, something more valuable than a signed contract. Perspective. The kind that cannot be bought, only earned. And as he reached the door, he paused for a brief second, glancing back not at the table, not at the skyline, but at the space where he had once believed he controlled everything, and understood that control without awareness is only an illusion. Then he stepped forward, into a city that had not changed, but into a mindset that had. While behind him, Naomi continued moving through the room with quiet precision, unseen by most, but no longer unknown. Because the truth about power had already been spoken, and it did not need to be repeated.